Imagine you're at the mall, enjoying a routine day, when suddenly you're accused of something you didn't do. That's exactly what happened to Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, an elderly woman who found herself harassed by security officers. Little did they know, her son was just about to arrive. What unfolded next was nothing short of shocking. Stick around to see how this dramatic tale plays out. But before we dive in, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. We love connecting with viewers around the globe. It was a tranquil afternoon at the mall. Mrs. Ruby Jenkins, a gracious 70-year-old woman with soft gray hair and a gentle presence, was out shopping for her usual groceries. Her cane clicked softly on the tiled floor as she navigated the aisles, her warm smile brightening her face. Her shopping bag contained simple items: bread, milk, fresh vegetables, and her favorite tea. Although her legs felt tired, she remained determined to handle her errands independently. As she approached the exit, she slowed her pace, taking a moment to breathe in the calm before heading home. Suddenly, two security officers in dark uniforms stepped in front of her, their expressions stern and unyielding. Towering over her, they seemed cold and suspicious. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you," one officer said, his voice low and accusatory. He crossed his arms, making it clear that she wasn't going anywhere. Mrs. Ruby looked up, startled and confused. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly, her heart beginning to race. "We received reports that you were shoplifting." The second officer interjected sharply, his tone harsh, as if he had already judged her guilty. The accusation stung, and Mrs. Ruby's smile faded. "Shoplifting? Me?" she gasped, clutching her cane tightly as panic surged through her. "No, sir," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I paid for all my things." She reached into her bag, her hands shaking with nervousness as she searched for her receipt. She finally found her receipt and held it up, but the officers didn't even glance at it. "We need you to come with us," the first officer said firmly, dismissing her attempt to prove her innocence. Mrs. Ruby felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Confusion raced through her mind. Why wouldn't they just check the receipt and let her go? She had always been careful, always followed the rules. Why were they treating her this way? "But I didn't steal anything," she pleaded again, her voice trembling with anxiety. Panic began to rise in her chest. It felt like they weren't listening. Without warning, one of the officers grabbed her arm. The sudden grip made her flinch, nearly causing her to drop her cane. "Let go!" she exclaimed, trying to pull away as he yanked her toward the back of the store. Her heart raced as disbelief washed over her. She couldn't fathom what was happening. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," she begged, but the officers showed no signs of compassion. They pulled her harder, and pain shot through her weary body. Desperately, she glanced around the mall, hoping someone would intervene. People watched but remained frozen, whispering among themselves and casting judgmental glances. Mrs. Ruby felt completely alone. Tears welled in her eyes. She had never been in trouble before, never even raised her voice to anyone. Yet here she was, being dragged to the mall like a criminal. It was humiliating and terrifying. Her breathing became shallow, and her vision blurred as tears spilled over. In the struggle, her purse slipped from her arm, and her phone tumbled to the ground with a soft thud. The officer continued to drag her toward the back room, oblivious to her distress. But Mrs. Ruby noticed. Her heart skipped a beat. Her son Oliver, her strong and brave son, had always told her to call if she needed help, and she needed him now more than ever. With trembling hands, she reached down to grab her phone, fingers shaking as she tried to unlock it. Despite the officers pulling her along, she managed to press the call button and dial his number. The phone rang once, then twice. Finally, she heard a click. "Mom." Oliver's deep voice came through the line. Mrs. Ruby's voice quivered as she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oliver, please come. They're hurting me. I don't know what to do." It was hard to get the words out, but Oliver understood. "I'm coming, Mom." "Hold on," he replied, urgency in his tone. He arrived at the mall within minutes, his heart racing as he parked hastily. He rushed inside, scanning the area until he spotted her, his mother being pushed around by two security officers near the back of a store. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. She looked so small and fragile between the two burly men, her face streaked with tears. They gripped her arms tightly, dragging her toward a back room as if she were a criminal. A mix of rage and sorrow surged through him. His sweet mother, who had never harmed a soul, was being treated this way. A fire ignited in his chest, but he knew he had to stay calm. Oliver inhaled deeply, steadying himself for what was to come. He couldn't let his emotions take control. He was trained for high-pressure situations, and this was no different. Yet, deep inside, his heart was screaming as he approached. His eyes were locked on the officers, his steps firm and fists clenched at his sides. Blood simmered in his veins, but his face remained stoic. His mother's safety was all that mattered now. "Mom!" Oliver called, his voice deep and controlled, though it took every ounce of strength to maintain that composure. Mrs. Ruby looked up, clearly shaken, her tear-filled eyes widening in relief. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice cracking. Captain Johnson walked straight up to the officers, his chest rising and falling with each measured breath. His mere presence drew the attention of the crowd that had gathered nearby, but the security officers seemed indifferent. "This is none of your business, sir," one of them snapped, glaring at Oliver, clearly dismissing him as just another upset bystander. "Step back, or we'll have to take action." Oliver clenched his jaw, fighting the anger that simmered just beneath the surface. His dark eyes narrowed as he locked gazes with the officer. "It is my business. That's my mother." The officer blinked, momentarily taken aback by the authority in Oliver's voice. But instead of backing down, he tightened his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm, as if to assert his power. Oliver's hands balled into fists at his sides. He wanted to knock the officer's hand off her, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Your mother?" the second officer scoffed. "Doesn't matter. She's suspected of theft, and we're taking her to the back to deal with it. Unless you want to get involved in this mess, I suggest you leave." The fire in Oliver's chest roared louder, but he kept his voice steady. "She's done nothing wrong. You can check the receipt in her bag, but before you do anything else, you need to let go of her." The officers exchanged offensive glances. The first officer took a step toward Oliver, puffing out his chest, clearly unaware of who he was dealing with. "You need to back off now, sir, or we'll call the police." Oliver almost smiled at the absurdity. "Call the police?" he challenged. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, unsure how to respond to Oliver's calm confidence. Rather than backing down, he tried to intimidate him further. "I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you interfere, we'll arrest you too." At that, Oliver's patience began to wear thin. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his badge and holding it up for the officers to see. "I am Captain Oliver Johnson, 15th Precinct," he declared, his voice cold and commanding. "You will let go of my mother." Both officers froze, eyes wide in shock, as if the ground had just vanished beneath them. The officers stammered, stumbling over their words as their faces turned pale, grappling with the reality of what had just occurred. This wasn't just any random man. This was a police captain, a figure who outranked every single person they could call. "Captain," one of the officers sputtered, releasing Mrs. Ruby's arm. "We didn't know, sir. We were just following orders." Oliver stepped closer, towering over them now. His mother was safe, but the anger he had kept at bay simmered just beneath the surface. He glared at the officers, his gaze sharp enough to cut through stone. "You didn't know?" Oliver repeated, his voice soft but laced with danger. "You didn't think to ask? You didn't think to check the receipt, to listen to her, or to treat her with respect?" The officers fell silent, one attempting to mumble an apology, but Oliver silenced him with a fierce look. "What if this was your mother?" he pressed, his voice tight with emotion. "What if she were the one being treated like a criminal, humiliated in front of strangers? would you still be so quick to lay your hands on her? Their faces flushed, eyes wide with fear and regret. They had no answer. They knew they were wrong. Turning to his mother, Oliver's expression softened as he gently took her hand. "Are you okay, Mom?" Mrs. Ruby, still shaken, nodded slowly. "I'm okay now, Oliver," she whispered, her voice trembling. He squeezed her hand reassuringly and then faced the officers once more. "You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs about this," he said coldly. "Get out of my sight." Without another word, the officers backed away, heads hung low in shame. Oliver wrapped his arm around his mother's shoulders and led her out of the store. His heart still pounded in his chest, but his mother was safe, and that was all that mattered. Mrs. Ruby clutched Oliver's arm, her body still trembling from fear and humiliation. She looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, son," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. The weight of the moment hit Oliver hard. His heart ached for her. She had always been so strong and proud, and seeing her treated this way filled him with sorrow. As they left the mall, the weight of the ordeal lingered in the air, but so did a sense of satisfaction. The officers would be held accountable for their actions, and justice would be served. Though Mrs. Ruby's heart still ached from the hurt she had endured, she knew one thing for certain. Her brave and loyal son had made things right. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more gripping tales like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story. Join our community and stay tuned for more amazing content.